The room smelled of candle wax and fear. A thin girl lay on the bed, her body trembling under the weight of pain she could barely understand. Her hair clung to her damp forehead, and her lips were pale, bitten raw from holding back screams. The midwives moved in shadows, whispering prayers in hushed Latin, as though afraid that even God might hear what was happening here. She was 13. The world beyond these walls was already heavy with blood. England was not a kingdom at peace. It was a battlefield, without borders, where cousins turned swords against each other, and the crown passed from hand to hand like a curse. And here in this suffocating chamber, the future of that crown depended on a child's breaking body. Lady Margaret Beaufort had not chosen this path. She had been told whom to marry, told when to obey, told when to open her womb to the demands of men far older and far more ruthless than she could yet imagine. She was not yet a woman, but she was expected to endure a woman's agony. Each cry she swallowed burned her throat. Every push carved fire through her bones. The air was so thick with heat and candle smoke that it felt like the walls were closing in. But there was no escape. Not from the bed. Not from the bloodline she was bound to serve. Outside, the bells tolled again, not for her, but perhaps they should have. For whatever innocence Margaret had left was dying here tonight alongside the girl she had been replaced by the mother of England's future king. When Margaret Beaufort first opened her eyes to the world, England was already splintering. It was 1443, and the Wars of the Roses had not yet erupted into open carnage, but the seeds were sown, seeds of suspicion, greed, and betrayal that would grow into decades of civil war. The houses of Lancaster and York eyed each other like wolves, circling the same prey. Every noble birth was a potential weapon, every marriage a battlefield. Margaret's father, John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, was a man both blessed and cursed by blood. He carried the royal line through the legitimized Beaufort branch of the House of Lancaster, but his life ended in disgrace, dead before Margaret could remember his face, leaving her the sole heiress to his title and fortune. She was barely a year old when whispers began to weave around her name, a girl of royal descent, rich enough to tempt the ambitious, young enough to be molded, married, or manipulated. Her mother, Margaret Beauchamp, knew the dangers. In a world where alliances shifted like tides, a girl with wealth and bloodline was not a daughter to be protected, but a prize to be traded. The child grew up in a courtly maze of smiling faces and calculating eyes, where every hand that stroked her hair might already be measuring the weight of her dowry. By the time she could read, Margaret understood that her life was not her own. She learned to sit straight, to speak softly, to listen more than she talked, not because she was shy, but because in silence you could hear the plotting. Outside the walls of her upbringing, England moved closer to the abyss. The court was a powder keg, and Margaret was unknowingly one of its sparks, a girl whose fate was to be thrust into the heart of a storm she could not control, yet would one day shape. Margaret was barely 12 when her childhood ended. In the England of the mid-15th century, noble girls were not courted, they were claimed. Marriage was not a matter of love or even preference. It was the most valuable form of political currency. And Margaret Beaufort, with her royal blood and vast inheritance, was a coin worth a kingdom. The decision was not hers. It never could be. While she recited her prayers and copied her Latin lessons, men twice and thrice her age whispered over maps and wine cups about whom she would wed. They did not speak of whether the man would be kind, whether he would protect her, whether her small, untested body could bear the weight of pregnancy. They spoke only of the advantages, the titles, the land, and which faction in the looming conflict would gain her allegiance through marriage. The choice fell upon Edmund Tudor, half-brother to King Henry VI. A man in his mid-20s, hardened by court life and the murmur of coming war, Edmund saw the union as a step toward power. For Margaret, it was a door closing on the last sliver of her own will. There was no courtship, no romantic prelude. One day she was a girl at her mother's side, The next, she was a bride, her signature pressed onto documents she could barely comprehend, binding her to a man she had barely spoken to. The law and the church called it a marriage. Margaret knew deep down it was something else, an arrangement that treated her body as an instrument and her womb as a pawn in the Game of Thrones, long before that phrase existed. And as the ink dried, the clock began ticking toward the most dangerous trial of her young life, a trial she was not yet strong enough to face, yet could not escape. Margaret Beaufort entered marriage not as a partner, but as property. The halls she now walked were not the familiar corridors of her mother's household, but stone passages echoing with the footsteps of men who measured worth in titles and alliances. Every gaze upon her was calculating not in admiration, but in assessment. She was the king's sister-in-law now, but her power was silent, bound up in her potential to produce an heir. Edmund Tudor, her husband, treated the union as an obligation to the realm. To him, Margaret's youth was secondary to the urgency of securing a son who could bolster his position in a kingdom fracturing under civil unrest. England was already rumbling toward what would become the Wars of the Roses, and in such a climate, every legitimate birth was a weapon. For Margaret, the reality was suffocating. She was 13, a child by every measure except the law. Her life was now dictated by courtly duties she barely understood, surrounded by people she could not trust. Privacy was a luxury she no longer owned. Even her body was subject to public interest. In this world of men, her voice was almost irrelevant. When she spoke, it was carefully, always aware that a misstep could carry political consequences. She learned quickly to read faces to sense when a smile hid an insult or when flattery disguised manipulation. Her survival depended on it. But the most perilous demand loomed unspoken she was expected to conceive. The court whispered it as if it were inevitable, as if a girl who had not yet reached full maturity could simply become a mother without risk. What no one admitted was the truth every midwife knew, that pregnancy at such an age could shatter a girl's body beyond repair. Yet in the political games of 15th century England, that danger was invisible. What mattered was the heir, not the mother. And so under the gilded ceilings of a royal household, the countdown began toward a trial that would test not only her strength but the fragile boundary between life and death. By the time winter's frost began to creep across the castle windows, whispers had turned into certainty. Lady Margaret was with child. At 13, her body was still narrow-hipped and fragile, her frame ill-suited for the strain of carrying life. But no one saw her condition as a risk. To the court, her pregnancy was a triumph proof that the Tudor bloodline would secure its foothold in the shifting sands of English politics. Margaret's days blurred into a ritual of observation. Servants reported on her appetite, midwives took her pulse as if guarding the kingdom's heartbeat, and the household steward noted every sign of health or fatigue. She was no longer a girl, she was an incubator for a dynasty. But beneath the careful watch of the court, fear gnawed at her. She had seen what childbirth could do to women, twice her age, bodies broken, mothers buried, before they ever held their child. The midwives whispered their own warnings in hushed tones. When the men were gone, a girl this young could bleed out, could tear beyond healing. Her husband, Edmund Tudor, was relentless in his insistence that this was her duty. Yet fate dealt a cruel twist. Before the child could be born, Edmund himself fell ill-struck by the plague that still haunted the land. Within weeks, the once ambitious noble was gone, leaving Margaret not only a widow, but a pregnant widow in a court that measured women's value by the men who claimed them. In the wake of Edmund's death, the pressure only intensified. Without his protection, she was more vulnerable than ever. Every nobleman with a claim to influence saw her and her unborn child as pieces in a larger game. And Margaret understood the wrong alliance could mean ruin. As the final months of her pregnancy approached, she moved through the halls with the grace of someone carrying both a child and the crushing weight of expectation. Every step toward her confinement was a step toward a moment that could crown her as the mother of England's future king, or end her life before she ever truly began living. The winter winds howled outside the thick stone walls as Margaret was led into the birthing chamber, a room stifling with heat from the roaring fire meant to keep the life in her. Candles flickered along the walls, casting long, wavering shadows that made the midwives' faces seem like shifting masks of concern. She was 13, but her body had not yet broadened for childbirth. The midwives exchanged wary glances they thought she wouldn't notice. In that moment, Margaret understood what none of the smiling courtiers had admitted. The kingdom wanted an heir, but it might take her life to get one. The labor began with slow, tightening waves that soon rose into crushing torrents of pain. She gritted her teeth knuckles white as she clutched the bed linens, while the women around her urged her to push, to breathe, to endure. Outside the chamber, priests whispered prayers. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of sweat, blood, and burning wax. Hours bled into each other. Her young frame strained her screams, breaking into hoarse sobs. Somewhere between the contractions, she thought of her dead husband and how he would never know the child he had set in her womb. That loss mingled with terror, and for the first time she wondered if she would ever open her eyes again after this night. When the child finally came, it was with a ripping pain that left her gasping and trembling. The midwives worked frantically to stop the bleeding, their hands moving, with the desperation of those who knew how easily the balance could tip toward death. The baby's cry pierced the chamber, thin, insistent, alive. Henry. Her son. England's future. Margaret, pale and near collapse, managed to touch his tiny hand before darkness closed in around her vision. She didn't know if she would wake again, but one thought burned bright even as her strength faded. Whatever it cost her, this child would live. When Margaret awoke, the room was quiet, except for the crackle of the fire. The first thing she noticed was the ache that ran through her body, as though every bone and muscle had been torn and stitched back together. The second was the absence of her child's cry. Her heart lurched. She struggled upright, ignoring the midwife's urgent pleas to rest. Only when they placed the swaddled infant in her arms did her breathing steady. Henry was warm, breathing impossibly small, a living reminder of both her survival and her loss. The days that followed were a blur of recovery, but even as her body mended, Margaret's mind was sharpening. She was 13 years old, a widow, and the mother of a boy who carried the blood of England's kings. That blood was both a blessing and a target. In the chessboard of noble ambition, Henry was now a pawn, or worse, a threat to be eliminated. Margaret understood something many older seasoned courtiers did not expect from a girl her age. In England's turbulent politics, birthright was meaningless without power to protect it. She could not simply trust in the goodwill of others. She began to take mental note of who visited, of the words they used when they spoke of her son. Was he the heir, or merely the child? Were their smiles warm or calculated? In the silence of her chambers, she whispered to Henry promises he could not yet understand, that she would guard him against every danger, that his life would not be squandered in the games of men hungering for crowns. Her vow was not the sentimental hope of a grieving widow. It was steel forged in pain. She would learn the languages of power, alliance, loyalty, influence, and wield them for his sake. Outside, the realm moved on as if the life and near death of a young mother were a passing event. But in Margaret's heart, a transformation had taken root. She was no longer just a girl who had survived childbirth. She was a mother with a mission, and she would walk through fire again if it meant keeping her son alive. Margaret's chambers became her watchtower. From its carved wooden windows, she could see the comings and goings of messengers, nobles, and retainers, each one a potential ally or a hidden threat. She had learned quickly that in the court's hushed corridors, words traveled faster than any writer and cut deeper than any sword. Whispers reached her long before they were meant to. Some spoke of her son with reverence, calling him the last great hope for the House of Lancaster. Others dismissed him as a fragile infant too weak to survive the storms ahead. But the most chilling murmurs were those she overheard when the speakers thought her beyond hearing suggestions that England would be steadier without another claimant to the throne, especially one so young, so vulnerable. Margaret began to read danger in every gesture. A lingering look from a visiting nobleman, a question too pointed about Henry's health, a gift sent to her household, its meaning cloaked in politeness but reeking of calculation. She realized that the greatest threats rarely came with drawn blades. They arrived as smiles, invitations, and sealed letters. The Wars of the Roses had not ended in spirit. Beneath the surface of treaties and marriages, the old rivalries between York and Lancaster still festered. And now her son, barely strong enough to grip her finger, was a piece on that blood-stained chessboard. It was in these days that Margaret's resolve hardened. She refused to be the passive figure that her youth and gender made others assume. She cultivated her own network ladies-in-waiting, who carried her words, discreetly loyal servants who could listen without drawing suspicion, and distant allies who owed her favors. Every scrap of information mattered. One evening, as candlelight danced against the walls, a trusted handmaiden leaned in and whispered of a nobleman's private toast, a celebration over the inevitable downfall of the Beaufort line. Margaret felt the old ache in her body, the echo of her near death, but her mind was sharper than ever. They might see her as a powerless widow. They would soon learn that she was neither powerless nor willing to be anyone's victim. For in the shadows where her enemies plotted, Margaret had already begun to plan. Margaret knew that survival in the turbulent Game of Thrones was not a matter of brute force. It was a matter of foresight, of moving before your enemy even realized the game had begun. Her first step was to secure Henry's safety through distance. The farther he was from the webs of courtly intrigue, the harder it would be for rivals to ensnare him. Under the guise of ensuring his health, she arranged for her son to be raised in carefully chosen households, each loyal to her cause. It was a painful decision every day apart from him carved at her heart, but she knew the greatest act of love she could give was protection. While Henry was shielded from immediate danger, Margaret immersed herself in the shifting alliances of England's noble families. She became fluent in the language of diplomacy, a conversation not of words, but of marriages, promises, and calculated debts. Every banquet was a battlefield, every shared cup of wine a negotiation. She learned which smiles were sincere and which were daggers wrapped in silk. But protection alone was not enough. She needed power, influence, strong enough to shield Henry not just from shadows, but from armies. In the candlelit privacy of her chambers, she began writing letters to men of influence, former allies, of Lancaster discontented nobles under Yorkist rule, and even certain Yorkists whose ambition outpaced their loyalty. Her pen became her sword. Each message was crafted with precision, hinting at mutual benefit without ever laying her plans bare. She offered respect where flattery was needed, firmness where authority must be shown. She was no longer the child bride they once dismissed. She was a mother on a mission, and nothing was more dangerous than that. Margaret understood one more truth, that the tides of war could turn without warning. She positioned herself not as a desperate claimant, but as a quiet constant in England's chaos, a figure people could rely on when the next storm broke. And in those unpredictable years, storms were never far away. By the time her rivals realized how far her influence reached, it would already be too late. She would be ready. Henry would be ready. And England itself would have no choice but to take notice. Years passed, and the war between Lancaster and York bled England dry. Castles fell, kings were dethroned, and loyalties shifted like sand under a restless tide. Through it all, Margaret Beaufort endured not by brute force, but by patience, sharpened to a blade. Her son Henry Tudor grew into a man under her careful orchestration. Though he had spent much of his youth in exile far from the court that might destroy him, he carried the quiet confidence of someone raised with a singular destiny. Margaret's letters to him were not just words of comfort. They were maps, strategies, and coded instructions teaching him the dangerous art of survival before he ever set foot on English soil again. Then came the moment she had waited for. The Yorkist crown was slipping, its enemies multiplying. The death of King Richard III's heir sent tremors through the nobility. Margaret sensed the vacuum of power, the opening she had been preparing for all her life. She moved with the precision of a master player. Alliances were cemented, promises sworn, and Henry's claim to the throne was bound to that of Elizabeth of York, uniting two warring houses in one marriage. It was not just a bid for power, it was the blueprint for peace in a kingdom drowning in blood. The Battle of Bosworth in 1485 would decide it all. Henry, now a man forged by years of exile and guided by his mother's foresight, faced Richard III on the field. The clash was brutal, but when Richard lay dead and Henry was crowned, Margaret's lifelong gamble had paid off. Yet her story did not end there. As the king's mother, she wielded influence without precedent, shaping policy, court life, and even the moral tone of the new Tudor dynasty. But the cost was written on her face, the lines carved by years of sacrifice, the quiet grief of a woman who had given her youth, her body, and her heart to a cause larger than herself. Margaret Beaufort had begun her journey as a girl of 13, used as a pawn in a kingdom's brutal game. She ended it as the mother of a king, the architect of a dynasty, and one of the most formidable political minds England had ever known. Her legacy was not just in the crown her son wore, but in the truth. Her life proved that power is rarely won in the heat of battle. It is forged in the long, cold patience of those who can see beyond their own lifetime.